hemlock nuts. Cracking the Restoration's toughest subjects through rational, balanced analysis of source material.
As disciples of Jesus, we seek the truth. The only way we keep growing is to embrace the fact that our current understanding is incomplete and to continue the persistent search for knowledge of things as they really are. In that continual quest to identify truth, every member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has to decide. Two important figures in church history insist that the other is a liar, and both can't be telling the truth. They are Emma Smith and Brigham Young. Throughout her life, Emma Smith consistently claimed that Joseph, her husband, never taught or practiced plural marriage. Emma claimed that after Joseph's death, the last time she spoke with Brigham, she told him, "You know too that Joseph, in my presence, told you that you had been teaching such things," meaning polygamy, "while he was alive, and that he commanded you in the name of the Lord to teach them no more, or judgments would overtake you." In an 1866 General Conference address, Brigham called Emma a liar, a tempted murderer, and the most wicked woman on earth. Quote, "To my certain knowledge, Emma Smith is one of the damnedest liars I know of on this earth. Yet there is no good thing I would refuse to do for her if she would only be a righteous woman, but she will continue in her wickedness. Not 6 months before the death of Joseph, he called his wife Emma into a secret council, and there he told her the truth, and called upon her to deny it if she could. He told her that the judgments of God would come upon her forthwith if she did not repent. He told her of the time she undertook to poison him. And he told her that she was a child of hell and literally the most wicked woman on this earth, that there was not one more wicked than she. Twice she undertook to kill him." End quote. Either Emma, identified by the Lord as an elect lady in D&C 25 and the first president of the Relief Society, or Brigham, an apostle and later president of the church, is a liar. Evidence exists to support both accounts. If Brigham told the truth, Joseph was a hypocrite that lied about his own involvement in polygamy while publicly opposing and excommunicating those who practiced it. If Emma was telling the truth, a small group of church leaders manufactured stories and historical records to misrepresent Joseph's position on plural marriage after he died. As we try to understand who is telling the truth, it's important to remember that compelling evidence exists to support both Emma's and Brigham's claims. This information may be surprising because as members of the church, we may not have been exposed to it before. It's important to recognize that this is because church publications consistently misrepresent Emma and her claims. As we consider evidence, we'll be partial to Joseph's public statements, and particularly to those things he published before his death, as they're more reliable than the things some claim he taught in secret that can't be validated objectively. The core question is what the prophet Joseph's true position was on plural marriage. So regarding Brigham's charge of attempted murder against Emma, consider the following. In August of 1842, Joseph wrote, "Oh, what a commingling of thought filled my mind for the moment. Again she is here, even in the seventh trouble, undaunted, firm and unwavering, unchangeable, affectionate Emma." These were Joseph's thoughts about Emma 16 months before she, according to Brigham, was called into a secret council and chastised for trying to kill him twice. Joseph and Emma's oldest surviving son, Joseph Smith III, had this to say about his parents' relationship. "It has been charged by certain ones advocating plural marriage that Emma was a thorn in Joseph's side, opposing his policies and leading him an ill life. This is absolutely not true. I was old enough at the time," he was 11 years old when his father died, "to know what was going on around me, and was closely associated with both my parents. The sleeping room I shared with my brothers was never more than a door away from where father and mother slept. Because of the great love and concern mother had for her children, she never wanted us far from her, in order that she might be on hand to take care of us herself in case of necessity. So I am sure that if there ever were angry words between my parents, I should have known it. And I can truthfully state that nothing of the kind ever occurred. Father was a kindly man and emphatically a home-loving one, whose wife and children were very dear to him, and who was, in turn, loved and respected by them." In January of 1844, at roughly the same time Brigham claims Joseph called Emma into a secret council and condemned her as, in Brigham's words, literally the most wicked woman on this earth, the history of the church records in contrast that Joseph had different feelings toward Emma. Quote, I took dinner in the north room and was remarking to Brother W. W. Phelps what a kind, provident wife I had, that when I wanted a little bread and milk, she would load the table with so many good things it would destroy my appetite. End quote. Another quote from Joseph Smith III. It has been reported by those who pretended to be friends of father that mother was quarrelsome and was antagonistic to my father, and frequently made trouble for him. I have this to say now, that tracing my memory back through the period of time in which my father was permitted to stay with his family, that I never heard any quarreling or harsh language between them under any circumstances, and that even disagreements between them were not conducted in a noisy or angry manner, that mother's language was quiet and temperate, and so was father's. In 1879, Emma explained, at one time my husband came to me and asked me if I had heard certain rumors about spiritual marriages or anything of the kind, and assured me that if I had, that they were without foundation, that there was no such doctrine and never should be with his knowledge or consent. I know that he had no other wife or wives than myself in any sense, either spiritual or otherwise. On page 490 of the first volume of Saints, it reads, because neither Joseph nor Emma wrote down how they felt about plural marriage, many questions are left unanswered. It's unclear whether the authors of Saints were ignorant of Emma's true position on plural marriage, which I think is unlikely, or if they simply ignored it because it contradicts the historical narrative they were trying to reinforce. Regardless of motive, I think it's clear, and will become clear as we consider further examples in this presentation, that Saints should more appropriately be considered well-meaning historical fiction than legitimate history. Based on the quotes we reviewed so far, as a standard of truth, it falls short. To that point, did the prophet Joseph really never record how he felt about plural marriage? Because Joseph F. Smith claimed he did. In 1905, Joseph F. Smith, then president of the church, published a series of letters he'd exchanged with Richard C. Evans of the Reorganized Church entitled Blood Atonement and the Origin of Plural Marriage, in which he claimed that the prophet Joseph had recorded his feelings on plural marriage. Evans claimed that everything the prophet Joseph had ever published during his lifetime had always, without exception, condemned polygamy. In response, Joseph F. Smith wrote, starting in the blue box on the bottom left, you confidently affirm that there is not a single word in a single sermon, lecture, statement, newspaper, or church publication printed during the life of Joseph Smith wherein he by word has endorsed the doctrine of plurality of wives, not a single statement. Whether any such statement was ever printed in his lifetime or not, I am not prepared to say, but I do know of such evidence being recorded during his lifetime, for I have seen it. I have copied the following from the prophet's manuscript record of October 5, 1843, and know it is genuine. Because the print gets really small on the original, I've included the same text from the History of the Church from the BYU website in the section in the middle of the screen so you can follow along more easily. Gave instructions to try those persons who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives, for according to the law I hold the keys of this power in the last days, for there is never but one on the earth at a time on whom this power and its keys are conferred. And I have constantly said, no man shall have but one wife at a time, unless the Lord directs otherwise. As President Joseph F. Smith explained, the quote can be traced back to the manuscript history of the church, shown here in the Joseph Smith Papers Project. But the problem is, this isn't the original source. The source for what we see here is a draft version, which shows how changes were made that actually reversed Joseph's original intent. This draft version provides a key to understand what changes were made to the prophet's journal after his death. As the editors of the Joseph Smith Papers Project indicate, a draft version was begun soon after Joseph Smith was killed. This draft shows several changes of interest. Some of the original text is crossed out, other text has been added by someone with different handwriting, and in the lower left margin we notice the words "to be revised," which were later crossed out. So how do these editorial changes impact the meaning? Well, let's read it. Evening at home and walked up and down the street with my scribe, gave instructions to try those persons who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives. If we skip down to find the next part of the original entry with the same handwriting, we see the final part reads, Joseph forbids it and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. The inserted text not only changes from the third person to the first person, it inserts language nearly identical to D&C 132.7, which wasn't published until 8 years after Joseph's death, that completely changes the meaning of the original entry. We'll consider section 132 later in this presentation, so for now, let's focus on this revised or edited version of Joseph's journal, which reads, gave instructions to try those persons who were preaching, teaching, or practicing the doctrine of plurality of wives. This is the beginning of the inserted text, which reads, for according to the law, I hold the keys of this power in the last days. For there is never but one on earth at a time on whom this power and the keys are conferred. And I have constantly said, now we notice that it completely removes the crossed out portion that says, Joseph forbids it and the practice thereof, and follows the curved line down to, no man shall have but one wife. Note the insertion again of additional text, at a time unless the Lord directs otherwise. Remember, these changes were all made after Joseph's death. But wait a sec. How can we know what was the original text and what were changes? We know because the original journal is also available from the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and this is what it says. And gave instructions to try those who were preaching, teaching, or appears to be the word practicing crossed out, the doctrine of plurality of wives. On this law Joseph forbids it, and the practice thereof. No man shall have but one wife. This is the only version Joseph would have been able to inspect for accuracy before his death. Now you can see why it becomes so important to trust Joseph's public statements, and even better, his published words, as they are the most protected from subsequent revisions. This content from the original journal lines up exactly with Joseph's other public statements. What made it into the final version and was published as the History of the Church lines up exactly with what Brigham Young taught after Joseph's death. Joseph's intent on October 5, 1843, was to try or formally charge in a church court those guilty of advocating or practicing polygamy. How does this align with other publicly available historical documentation? Well, luckily, 4 months after this journal entry condemning the doctrine of plurality of wives, Joseph and Hiram made their views on the topic known publicly in an article published in the Times and Seasons. Quote, as we have lately been credibly informed that an elder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints by the name of Hiram Brown has been preaching polygamy and other false and corrupt doctrines in the county of Lapeer, state of Michigan, this is to notify him and the church in general that he has been cut off from the church for his iniquity, and he is further notified to appear at the special conference on the 6th of April next to make answer to these charges. Joseph Smith and Hiram Smith, presidents of said church. This appeared in the Times and Seasons for February 1st, 1844, on page 423. Notice that Joseph and Hiram were the co-presidents of the church. Both presidents died in June of 1844, roughly 5 months after this was published. 6 weeks later, in March 1844, a letter was published in the Times and Seasons that Hiram wrote to members of the church in Hancock County, Illinois. The beginning of the letter starts in the blue box and ends at the bottom of the next column to the right, where we see it was written by Hiram. It reads, to the brethren of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints living on China Creek in Hancock County, greeting. Whereas Brother Richard Hewitt has called on me today to know my views concerning some doctrines that are preached in your place, and states to me that some of your elders say that a man having a certain priesthood may have as many wives as he pleases, and the doctrine is taught here. I say unto you that that man teaches false doctrine. For there is no such doctrine taught here, neither is there any such thing practiced here. And any man that is found teaching privately or publicly any such doctrine is culpable and will stand a chance to be brought before the high council and lose his license and membership also. Therefore, he had better be aware what he is about. Hiram's inclusion of any such thing or any such doctrine make it clear that there were no exclusions whether it was called spiritual wifery or polygamy or plural marriage. It was all wrong and not practiced or sanctioned by Joseph or Hiram. The timing of this letter, dated March 15, 1844, is very important, as Joseph and Hiram were killed just 3 months later in June of 1844. Interestingly enough, very similar doctrine that a man having a certain priesthood may have as many wives as he pleases would reappear several years later, but not in Illinois. It manifested itself again in a general conference talk given by Brigham Young in Utah 17 years after Joseph and Hiram died. In an 1861 General Conference address, Brigham claimed that, quote, "the second way in which a wife can be separated from her husband while he continues to be faithful to his God and his priesthood I have not revealed except to a few persons in this church, and a few have received it from Joseph the prophet as well as myself. If a woman can find a man holding the keys of the priesthood with higher power and authority than her husband, and he is disposed to take her, he can do so. Otherwise, she has got to remain where she is." Brigham went on to explain that if a woman claims protection at the hands of a man possessing more power in the priesthood and higher keys, if he is disposed to rescue her and has obtained the consent of her husband to make her his wife, he can do so without a bill of divorcement. As the one with the most priesthood keys, Brigham not only recognized the implication that such a policy would most favor him in attracting new plural wives, he bragged about it. In an 1857 talk in Salt Lake welcoming Thomas Marsh back to the church, Brigham said, "In conversing with Brother Marsh, I find that he is about the same. He has told you that he is an old man. Do you think that I am an old man? I could prove to this congregation that I am young, for I could find more girls who would choose me for a husband than can any of the young men." When Brother Thomas thought of returning to the church, the plurality of wives troubled him a good deal. Look at him. Do you think it need to? I do not, for I doubt whether he could get one wife. Why it should have troubled an infirm old man like him is not for me to say. End quote. From Brigham's perspective, the only problem a man should have with plural marriage would come from his inability to attract additional wives, not from any moral concerns. So let's go back to Joseph's journal that was revised after his death to reverse the meaning of what he actually said. There was a lot of effort put into the process of falsifying his journal. In addition to the original, there were 2 other copies produced, the second to facilitate the addition and deletion of key words and phrases, and the third to create a tiny manuscript that was turned into the print version of the History of the Church, published under the direction of the First Presidency in 1902. Remember, to counter the claim that Joseph had always condemned polygamy, this was ostensibly the best, if not only, quote President Joseph F. Smith could come up with in response. And thanks to the Joseph Smith Papers Project, we understand that the quote he used was fabricated. Were there any other clues or indications that this kind of disingenuous revisionist history was going on? Yes. One LDS historian, Richard Van Wagner, cited a claim by an assistant church historian, Charles Wandell, who was involved in the revisions in the 1850s. He explained, "The official history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints was published in book form under the direction of the First Presidency in 1902. The introductory assurance that no historical or doctrinal statement has been changed is demonstrably wrong." Here you can see the phrase that no historical or doctrinal statement has been changed, highlighted in blue in the History of the Church available on the BYU website. Continuing again with the quote. "Overshadowed by editorial censorship, hundreds of deletions, additions, and alterations, these 7 volumes are not always reliable. The 19th century propaganda mill was so adroit that few outside Brigham Young's inner circle were aware of the behind-the-scenes alterations so seamlessly stitched into church history. Charles Wesley Wandell, an assistant church historian, was aghast at these emendations, or revisions. Commenting on the many changes made in the historical work as it was being serialized in the Deseret News, Wandell noted in his diary, I noticed the interpolation or changes that were inserted, because having been employed in the historian's office at Nauvoo by Dr. Richards, and employed too in 1845 in compiling this very autobiography, I know that after Joseph's death, his memoir was doctored to suit the new order of things, and this too by the direct order of Brigham Young to Dr. Richards, and systematically by Richards. The Quorum of the 12, under Brigham Young's leadership, began altering the historical record shortly after Joseph Smith's death. Contrary to the introduction's claims, Smith did not author the history of the church. At the time of his 1844 death, the narrative had been written up to 5 August 1838, 6 years before Joseph's death, roughly. The history of the church indicates that Brigham and several other apostles began revising church history in April of 1845, roughly 10 months after Joseph and Hiram were killed. For example, Tuesday, April 1st, 1845, I commenced revising the history of Joseph Smith at Brother Richard's office. Elder Heber C. Kimball and George A. Smith were with me. President Joseph Smith had corrected 42 pages before his massacre. It afforded us great satisfaction to hear Brother Richards read the history of the infancy of the church, adjourned at 11 p.m., having read 140 pages in Book A. Wednesday, 2, engaged at Elder Richards' office with Elders Kimball and Smith revising church history. These aren't isolated examples. During the next month of May 1845, for example, I found 4 additional references to Brigham Young revising church history. Revisions were made to discredit those that opposed plural marriage. The church's website, see the box in the upper right corner, indicates that Sidney Rigdon was excommunicated for refusing to accept the 12's leadership. This is accurate, but omits Sidney's condemnation of the 12 for practicing polygamy secretly while lying about it during Joseph's life. Sidney was excommunicated in September 1844, and in October 1844 wrote, "It is a fact so well known that the 12 and their adherents have endeavored to carry on this spiritual wife business in secret that I hardly need mention it here, and have gone to the most shameful and desperate lengths to keep it from the public. How often have these men and their accomplices stood up before the congregation and called God and all the holy angels to witness that there was no such doctrine taught in the church, and it has now come to light by testimony which cannot be gainsaid, that at the time they thus dared heaven and insulted the world, they were living in the practice of these enormities, and there were multitudes of their followers in the congregation at the time who knew it." In 1836, Joseph taught that the 12 are subject to the first presidency when he said, "The 12 are not subject to any other than the first presidency, that is, myself, Sidney Rigdon, and Frederick G. Williams." Brigham changed this to support his claim that the 12 should be the ones to lead the church after Joseph's death, rather than Sidney Rigdon, who was in the first presidency when Joseph died, by adding the following words to the end of the quote, "who are now my counselors, and where I am not, there is no first presidency over the 12. Another example of changes made to discredit Sidney Rigdon after Joseph's death include conference minutes from October 1843 about conflict between Joseph and Sidney Rigdon, which reads as follows: "President Joseph Smith arose and satisfactorily explained to the congregation the supposed treacherous communication or correspondence with ex-Governor Carlin, which wholly removed suspicion from Elder Sidney Rigdon and from every other person. He expressed entire willingness to have Sidney Rigdon retain his station, provided he would magnify his office and walk and conduct himself in all honesty, righteousness, and integrity, but signified his lack of confidence in his integrity and steadfastness, judging from their past intercourse." So that's what the minutes read. The change that Brigham made was that all the red text in the first paragraph was later removed, and the red text in the bottom paragraph was added, which said, "President Joseph Smith arose and said, I have thrown him off my shoulders, and you have again put him off me. You may carry him, but I will not." These are the types of changes that Brigham made to discredit those that were critical of plural marriage after Joseph's death. So let's go back to Joseph's public statements. A month before Joseph died, he gave a talk in Nauvoo in which he vigorously denied charges of polygamy. In 1844, William Law, a former member of the First Presidency, formed a conspiracy to depose Joseph and take the leadership of the church away from him. William Law and others went to the county seat at Carthage and gave testimonies which resulted in 3 indictments being brought against Joseph. One accused him of being guilty of polygamy. Joseph's sermon in which he responded to the polygamy charge was given at the Stand, which was an outdoor meeting place near the temple building site in Nauvoo. Joseph declared, "Another indictment has been got up against me," meaning the polygamy indictment. "It appears a holy prophet," referring to William Law, "has risen up, and he has testified against me," causing the polygamy indictment to be brought forth. "God knows, then, that the charges against me are false. I had not been married scarcely 5 minutes and made one proclamation of the gospel before it was reported that I had 7 wives. I mean to live and proclaim the truth as long as I can. This new holy prophet, William Law, has gone to Carthage and swore that I had told him that I was guilty of adultery. This spiritual wifism, why a man dares not speak or wink for fear of being accused of this. William Law swears that I have committed adultery. I wish the grand jury would tell me who they, the alleged wives, are, whether it will be a curse or blessing to me. A man asked me whether the commandment was given that a man may have 7 wives, and now the new prophet has charged me with adultery. Wilson Law, William's brother, also swears that I told him I was guilty of adultery. I have rattled chains before in a dungeon for truth's sake. I am innocent of all these charges, and you can bear witness of my innocence, for you know me yourselves. What a thing it is for a man to be accused of committing adultery and having 7 wives, when I can find only one. I am the same man and am as innocent as I was 14 years ago, and I can prove them all perjurers. This talk was delivered a month before Joseph died. A few days before his death, Joseph had a conversation with Emma and his brother William. William Smith was an apostle in the church at the time Joseph and Hiram died. William wrote, quote, I called on your father and took breakfast with him. While seated at the table, a conversation was participated in by your mother, meaning Emma. In relating her report, she said that some complaint had been made to her by females whom she had visited, that John Taylor, Willard Richards, and Brigham Young had been teaching some doctrines among the saints privately that was going to ruin the church, unless there was a stop put to it, and it was contrary to the law and rules governing the church. Your father remarked that he would attend to the matter as soon as he got through with his troubles with the laws and fosters. That trouble with the laws and fosters refers to the publication of the Nauvoo Expositor. But mark you, their conversation took place only a few days previous to your father's death. What that private teaching might have been, that those persons whom your mother named were circulating in a clandestine manner, since there has been so much said about a doctrine called the plural wife doctrine on this subject, I leave the reader to judge. Interestingly, that talk by Joseph, which many members attended, in which he proclaimed his innocence from polygamy, was changed subtly after his death. Joseph said, You know my daily walk and conversations. I am in the bosom of a virtuous and good family. But the word family has been crossed out and changed to people. There seems to be a consistent pattern in the editorial changes made to obscure Joseph's esteem for his own family, while elevating the legitimacy of those that surrounded Joseph, particularly those that rose to lead the church after Joseph and Hiram passed away. Another example of this is found in the same talk. Here Joseph, once again defending himself against the charge of polygamy, said, For the last 3 years I have a record of all my acts and proceedings. They cannot charge me with any day or time, for they cannot prove anything against me. The revision adds these words, For I have kept several good, and then inserted faithful, and efficient clerks in constant employ. They have accompanied me everywhere and carefully kept my history, and they have written down what I have done, where I have been, and what I have said. This insertion appears to be an attempt to bolster the legitimacy of the changes these clerks working for Brigham would subsequently add to his record. The historical changes inserted by Brigham provide interesting insight into who he was. Sometimes the history of the church simply reprinted content from that was published previously. The portion of the church history shown here is a reprint of the Times and Seasons from October 1844. The entire paragraph in red was inserted into the history of the church after Joseph's death. Brigham thought to reinforce the importance of his arrival in Kirtland by inserting this paragraph as if Joseph had written it. It reads, About the 8th of November, I received a visit from elders Joseph Young, Brigham Young, and Heber C. Kimball of Mendon, Monroe County, New York. They spent 4 or 5 days at Kirtland, during which we had many interesting moments. And at one of our interviews, Brother Brigham Young and John P. Green spoke in tongues, which was the first time I had heard this gift among the brethren. Others also spoke, and I received the gift myself. Brigham inserted a story about Joseph claiming that they had both received the gift of tongues. Interestingly, there's another insertion in the manuscript history in this same paragraph that didn't make it into the print version of the history of the church, which was published after Brigham's death. It reads, Brother Joseph Young is a great man, but Brigham is a greater, and the time will come when he will preside over the whole church. Apparently, there were some limits to the revisionist changes that church historians were willing to tolerate. Brigham's historical revisions to elevate his own importance and discredit others that threatened his preeminence continue. It appears he sometimes engaged in impromptu creation of narratives to make whatever point he needed. These often took the form of private conversations with people that had passed away, in which they claimed whatever Brigham needed them to claim, even when such statements contradicted stories that Brigham had told previously. For example, the history of the church records that in October of 1844, just a few months after Joseph's death, Brigham delivered a talk to the saints in which he claimed that Joseph had ordained Hiram to take his place after him. He said, "Did Joseph ordain any man to take his place? He did. Who was it? It was Hiram. But Hiram fell a martyr before Joseph did. If Hiram had lived, he would have acted for Joseph." This statement is important to keep in mind as we consider what Brigham would say about Hiram subsequently. In his diary, Wilford Woodruff, who was working in the church historian's office in 1856, asked Brigham about a piece of history on Book E1, page 1681 and 2, concerning Hiram leading this church and tracing the Aaronic priesthood, to which Young advised it was not essential to be inserted in the history and had better be omitted. Brigham's desire to delegitimize the Smith family seems to have grown over time. In 1866, apostle and church historian George A. Smith was giving a talk in General Conference when Brigham Young got up and interrupted him to make some historical corrections. While Brigham's words are available, I can't find the text of Elder Smith's talk anywhere. Based on Brigham's corrections, it appears Elder Smith mentioned something about the prophet Joseph Smith's denial of an unspecified doctrine, as well as Joseph's anointing Hiram to lead the church after him, which is reasonable given that Brigham, as we just reviewed, had taught the same doctrine over 20 years before. But Brigham's claim this time was very different. Brigham went on to reinforce the importance of plural marriage, how Joseph had not intended that Hiram lead the church, but that Brigham was the only one Joseph trusted to take charge, and that Hiram would have led the church to hell. Elder Smith seems to have struck a nerve, and in response, Brigham appears to indulge in some historical improvisation to set the matter straight, contradicting himself in the process. The talk begins by explaining, quote, "The president arose to make some historical corrections, for which purpose George A. Smith, who was speaking, vacated the stand. Brigham proceeded to explain my memory of things which took place in his boyhood should be better than his," referring to George A. Smith. His first correction appears to be, "I would not be willing to say that Joseph ever denied any doctrine he published. He never did to my knowledge." Subsequently, he commented on Elder Smith's teaching about Hiram Smith, quote, "Brother George A. Smith spoke about Hiram Smith. I have heard Joseph tell him that if the church was left to his leadership, he would lead it directly to hell. If you remember, this is the same thing Joseph's brother, Apostle William Smith, claimed Joseph said about Brigham." Anyway, back to the Brigham quote. Brigham continues, "He never appointed his brother Hiram to be his successor. He never even thought of such a thing, and if my word is good for anything, I can say of a truth that Joseph told me not 3 months before he was killed, and I did not seek the information he gave me. We were talking upon counseling, governing, and controlling, that if I am moved out of the way, you are the only man living on this earth who can counsel and direct the affairs of the kingdom of God on the earth." Brigham's pattern in these types of claims is consistent. He claims some type of private conversation with Joseph that no one else can refute, in which Joseph says something completely contrary to what he repeatedly taught in public settings and published to the world. Remember, it was in a secret council that Joseph supposedly called Emma the most wicked woman in the world, while at the same time praising her in his private journal. This 1862 quote from Brigham to the church is typical. "But were you not persecuted for teaching that odious doctrine called polygamy? No. We were planted in these valleys before it was publicly made known to the people. Only a few of Joseph Smith's intimate friends knew it previous to its being published to the world, which was several years after his death." In contrast, consider these words delivered by Joseph Smith 11 days before his death. "I am bold to declare I have taught all the strong doctrines publicly, and always teach stronger doctrines in public than in private." Brigham continues denigrating Hiram with the story of how Brigham had to convince Hiram to accept plural marriage. Brigham claimed Hiram said to him, quote, "I have a question for you. In the first place I say unto you that I do know that you and the 12 know some things that I do not know. I know there is something or other which I do not understand that is revealed to the 12. Is this so?" Brigham responded, "Brother Hiram, I will tell you about this thing which you do not know, if you will swear with an uplifted hand before God that you will never say another word against Joseph." He replied, "I will do it with all my heart." And he stood on his feet, saying, "I want to know the truth and to be saved." And he made a covenant there never again to bring forward one argument or use any influence against Joseph's doings. Brigham's unassailable superpower is secret knowledge. especially knowledge received from Joseph privately. Brigham tells this story to demonstrate Hiram's inferiority, who by his own admission lacked this secret knowledge. You and the 12 know some things that I do not know. I know there is something or other which I do not understand that is revealed to the 12. Is this so? Brigham and the 12's possession of secret knowledge is intended to imply both superior spiritual discernment and the ultimate post-martyrdom currency, which is having been trusted by Joseph. But something curious happens to Brigham's story at this point. Hiram's deficit changes from not knowing to basically knowing, but not being willing to believe. I can understand this by the motions and talk and doings of Joseph, and I have mistrusted for a long time that Joseph had received a revelation that a man should have more than one wife, and he has hinted as much to me, but I would not bear it. Brigham is effectively claiming that Hiram said, I knew about it, but I wouldn't accept it because I didn't trust Joseph. But I do trust you, so if you'll disclose the secret knowledge to me, I will believe. To me, this line of reasoning is jumbled and contradictory, but not to Brigham. Brigham's account asks us to believe that Hiram trusted Brigham more than he trusted Joseph. These are the same brothers that, according to John Taylor in D&C 135, in life they were not divided, and in death they were not separated. Interestingly, Brigham decides to address Hiram's lack of trust in Joseph by requiring him to make a covenant with God to never criticize Joseph again in exchange for the secret knowledge, which Hiram gladly accepts. I want to know the truth and to be saved. Another irony is that although Hiram, at this point in Brigham's story, has not yet had the secret knowledge revealed to him, he somehow understands that it is required for his salvation. Obedience to the law of plural marriage as a requirement for salvation was taught by Brigham vigorously after 1852. That the preceding story about Hiram was intended to discredit him as a potential successor to Joseph is made clear by Brigham's next words. It is a mistake with regard to Joseph ever saying that Hiram would be his successor. He ordained him a prophet and seer. There may be millions of prophets and seers and revelators, but none can hold the keys of the presidency over the church and kingdom of God in all the world without the apostleship. I knew of the doctrine of polygamy by revelation to myself while I was in England before it was revealed to me by Joseph. After Brigham finished speaking, George A. Smith, the church historian, got back up and said, I am thankful to be corrected. President Young has the best memory of any man on the earth. What would prompt Brigham to change the story he'd told 20 years before to attack Hiram's capability and legitimacy as a potential successor to Joseph? To answer that question, it helps to understand that the previous day, Brigham had given a talk in General Conference to suppress speculation that one of Joseph's sons would one day preside over the church. He said, There are a few here that know Joseph Smith the prophet, and some of them are apostatizing from the work which the Lord commanded him to found, to run after young Joseph Smith, the second son of the prophet, who has no more authority to set himself up as president and teacher of a people than any other man has in the sectarian world who possesses nothing of the priesthood. Later he said, Now you old Mormons, stop your talking about young Joseph and about David, who was another of Joseph and Emma's sons, going to preside over the church by and by. I wish he was prepared for it, would repent of his sins and come in at the door, and be one with us, and walk up to the 12 in the first presidency, saying, I am one with you, and am your servant. So now it becomes clearer why Brigham felt the need to change his story about Hiram as Joseph's successor. Joseph and Emma's sons were getting old enough that they began to represent a potential threat to Brigham, and so his story changed to discredit and delegitimize another Smith, in this case Hiram, as Joseph's intended successor. This indicates that Brigham perceived the threat as real and that he needed to do something about it, and that something was in part to create a new story that contradicted his previous claim. So let's go back to the church's claim that Joseph didn't write down how he felt about plural marriage. This is again demonstrably incorrect when we consider both the 1835 and 1844 versions of the Doctrine and Covenants. On the day that Joseph Smith and Hiram died, there was a section in the Doctrine and Covenants that dealt specifically with marriage that clearly establishes monogamy as the rule of the church. Originally introduced in the 1835 version of the Doctrine and Covenants as Section 101, it stated the following: Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in the case of death, where either is at liberty to marry again. It is not right to persuade a woman to be baptized contrary to the will of her husband, neither is it lawful to influence her to leave her husband. In the preface to the 1835 edition of the D&C, Joseph specifically approved the content, which reads, "We do not present this little volume with any other expectation than that we are to be called to answer to every principle advanced." The 1844 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, in which the section on marriage had become section 109, was prepared for publication just prior to Joseph's death in 1844 and contained the same words originally written by Oliver Cowdery regarding marriage. This declaration on marriage, published twice, 9 years apart, the second being finalized just prior to his death, reiterate Joseph's views on the subject. Let me read it one more time. "Inasmuch as this Church of Christ has been reproached with the crime of fornication and polygamy, we declare that we believe that one man should have one wife and one woman but one husband, except in the case of death, where either is at liberty to marry again." Weighing Joseph's public statements and publications, objective evidence that's more difficult to manipulate or ignore, Emma's claims are plausible. Another important fact to consider that also bolsters Emma's assertion is that no descendant of Joseph and any of the alleged plural wives has ever been identified. Joseph and Emma conceived 9 children together. If, as the church claims, Joseph had as many as 40 wives and he slept with even a portion of them, we would expect at least a few children to have been produced. None have ever been identified. The question of Joseph's paternity with plural wives has been spurred by sources like Fawn Brody's book No Man Knows My History, which named possible children of the prophet Joseph Smith and plural wives, as well as anecdotal family histories that have proudly but erroneously claimed descendancy from Joseph Smith. A Deseret News article from 2011 describes how DNA evidence was gathered to disprove the remaining possible descendants of Joseph and any woman besides Emma. It's interesting that this question reemerged relatively recently, as it was understood and accepted while polygamy was still being practiced that Joseph never produced any children with any of the alleged plural wives. When asked in 1879 why the prophet didn't have any polygamous children, Joseph F. Smith didn't try to refute the premise of the question. He responded, because it would have been against him and the law of the state against bigamy. The children would have been proven to be his, or the mothers would have been condemned for illicit intercourse, polygamous marriages not being considered legitimate marriages. So how could such serious error have been introduced? As I've worked to piece together a plausible scenario, it appears it may have started around 1840 in England. Later in life, Brigham admitted that he received revelation, including visions regarding plural marriage, while on a mission to England sometime between 1839 and 1841. Significantly, he claimed to have received those revelations before Joseph ever said anything about plural marriage to him. Some of the other apostles and missionaries in England appear to have accepted plural marriage as legitimate in that same time frame, and it appears they began recruiting additional wives while keeping it secret from Joseph. This fueled the fire of John Bennett's immoral seductions in Nauvoo, which relied upon assertions that Joseph and other top church leaders sanctioned Bennett's spiritual wifery. That in turn led Joseph to frequently and adamantly preach against polygamy publicly, as we've seen throughout this presentation. Joseph was sealed to both men and women as a way of expanding the kingdom of God on earth, but it wasn't sexual. During the latter part of Joseph's life, particularly after he received the July 1843 revelation on monogamous sealing for eternity, it seems he began to refer to such kingdom-building sealings as adoptions. Joseph's non-sexual sealings to women were later conflated with marriage. A July 1843 revelation was subsequently altered to support polygamy and published in 1852, 8 years after Joseph's death, as D&C 132. It appears that Brigham was willing to justify the historical manipulations because he believed his revelation in England had been from God, but would not have been accepted by the church without making it look like it had come from Joseph. Let's consider some evidence that supports this hypothesis. In 1874, Brigham gave a talk in Salt Lake in which he said, "We were driven from Missouri after Joseph went up there, and we came to Nauvoo, and the 12 went to England. While we were in England, I think, the Lord manifested to me by vision and his Spirit things that I did not then understand. I never opened my mouth to anyone concerning them until I returned to Nauvoo. Joseph had never mentioned this. There had never been a thought of it in the church that I ever knew anything about at that time. But I had this for myself and kept it to myself. When I returned home and Joseph revealed these things unto me, then I understood the reflections of my mind while in England, but this was not until I had told him what I understood." This was in 1841. The revelation, D&C 132, was given in 1843, but the doctrine was revealed before this." End quote. Brigham was not the only one to receive a revelation legitimizing polygamy while on a mission in England. In May of 1899, President Lorenzo Snow gave a talk in St. George in which he said, "As to plural marriage, I want to say a few words, for I may not have the opportunity of bearing my testimony to you again. There is no man that lives that had a more perfect knowledge of the principle of plural marriage, its holiness and divinity, than what I had. It was revealed to me before the prophet Joseph Smith explained it to me. I had been on a mission to England between 2 and 3 years, which I think would have been 1840 to 1843, and before I left England, I was perfectly satisfied in regard to something connected to plural marriage. Willard Richards and William Clayton were clerks that recorded many of Joseph's journal entries and meeting minutes. Both of them served as missionaries in England during this same time frame. Thomas Stafford, a member of the church who lived in Manchester, England, while Brigham Young was a missionary there, moved to Nauvoo in 1842. He observed the following behavior by Brigham, quote, "But I am fully convinced, as I was then, that Brigham was in adultery in Manchester, England, in the fall, winter, and spring of 1840 and 1841. Elizabeth Mayer is the person with whom Brigham was then committing adultery. My reasons are these. We lived next door to her under the same roof. This Elizabeth Mayer had a father and a brother who were gardeners. They took their dinners as they worked a long piece from home. After they had left for work, Brigham would step into the house. She would then lock the door and pull down the blinds and curtains, which to me was strange. He never came to see our folks, although not 5 steps apart, and when he left, he was always in a hurry, and she never came to the door with him when he was leaving. This same thing occurred in Nauvoo with a woman and Brigham. Her name was Greenough. Her son was about my age, was always driven out when Brigham came. The door was shut and the curtains lowered. I was puzzled to know why he acted so. If he had a good heart and was engaged in the business of teaching the truth, why drive the boy out? Why not come also and see my mother, only a few steps apart? I am now and was then satisfied that he was in adultery in Manchester, England. The seeds of polygamy were sown, and Brigham the sower. I was present at a meeting in a grove at Nauvoo about 3 weeks before Joseph and Hiram were murdered, when Joseph made a public statement in the presence of 3,000 people that polygamy was being practiced secretly by some, that it had crept into the church secretly and must be put down speedily or the church would be driven from Nauvoo. I am satisfied that Joseph was not in favor of it at all, would swear to all I have stated." End quote. Thomas Stafford eventually aligned himself with the reorganized church and was a 70 in that organization when he wrote the letter from which this quote was taken. So if Brigham and not Joseph brought plural marriage into the church, why was Joseph sealing people to himself? Because Joseph had his calling and election made sure, he knew he was assured a place in the celestial kingdom. And because Joseph had also received the sealing power from God, he had the ability to seal or adopt others to himself to ensure the same blessing for them. Joseph's approach, as we will see, was to use the sealing power liberally in an inclusive way to bring many of the early saints with him into the celestial kingdom. Consider Joseph's words on the subject. Quote, "Let us suppose a case," starting in the upper left-hand corner. "Let us suppose a case. Suppose the great God who dwells in heaven should reveal himself to Father Cutler here by the opening heavens and tell him, I offer up a decree that whatsoever you seal on earth with your decree, I will seal it in heaven. You have the power then. Can it be taken off? No. Then what you seal on earth by the keys of Elijah is sealed in heaven, and this is the power of Elijah." Next quote from Joseph. Again, the doctrine or sealing power of Elijah is as follows. If you have power to seal on earth and in heaven, then we should be wise. The first thing you do, go and seal on earth your sons and daughters unto yourself, and yourself unto your fathers in eternal glory, and go ahead and not go back, but use a little wisdom and seal all you can. And when you get to heaven, tell your Father that what you seal on earth should be sealed in heaven according to his promise. I will walk through the gate of heaven and claim what I seal, and those that follow me and my counsel. The original text in Wilford Woodruff's diary, from which this quote is derived, didn't say wise, it said crafty. Then we should be crafty. Go and seal on earth your sons and daughters unto yourself, and yourself unto your fathers in heaven, your fathers in eternal glory. Use a little craftiness and seal all you can, and when you get to heaven, Joseph's goal with all these sealings was to bring as many as he could justify with him into heaven. Joseph appears to be describing the same concept a few years before, using different terms. I charged the saints not to follow the example of the adversary in accusing the brethren, and said, if you do not accuse each other, God will not accuse you. If you have no accuser, you will enter heaven, and you will follow the revelations and instructions with it, and if you will follow the revelations and instructions with God, which God gives you through me, I will take you into heaven as my backload. Joseph seemed anxious to make use of the sealing power while it was still available. In January of 1844, he exhorted, "And I would to God that this temple was now done, that we might go into it and go to work and improve our time and make use of the seals while they are on earth." This concept of sealing or adoption was not well understood by the brethren when Joseph died. An example of this is a talk Brigham gave at winter quarters in 1847, in which he explained that the Lord introduced the law of adoption. This principle, I answer, is not clearly understood by many of the elders of this church at the present time, as it will hereafter be, and I confess that I have had only a smattering of these things. During the next week, Brigham had a dream in which Joseph appeared to him. Of all the questions Brigham could have asked, the one that was most pressing was for some help in understanding the law of adoption or sealing principles, which is important to understand that at this point, in 1847, they were considered interchangeable. In Brigham's words, I said, "Brother Joseph, the brethren you know well, better than I do. You raised them up and brought the priesthood to us. The brethren have a great anxiety to understand the law of adoption or sealing principles. And if you have a word of counsel from me, I should be glad to receive it." Interestingly, Joseph didn't answer his question. He told Brigham to tell the people to be humble and faithful, be sure to keep the Spirit of the Lord, and it will lead them right. Joseph's practice of sealing men to himself continued for quite a while after his death. In 1856, Brigham explained that these sealings were the highest ordinance in the church. Quote, "We will seal men to men by the keys of the holy priesthood. This is the highest ordinance. It is the last ordinance of the kingdom of God on the earth, and above all the endowments that can be given you." End quote. In 1868, First Presidency member Daniel Wells' view was that, quote, "On adoption, he supposed it had reference to the linking together of the priesthood, that it might reach back to the link that had long since been broken, that it might present one unbroken chain," end quote. And Wilford Woodruff held a similar view, quote, "Man also will have to be sealed to man until the chain is united from Father Adam down to the last saint," end quote. Over time, what Joseph understood and practiced about adoption did not get past to subsequent church leaders, clearly enough to preserve the practice intact. In September 1887, 2 months after John Taylor died, his son-in-law, John Whitaker, wrote in his diary, "I went back to the office where I found Apostle Brother Lorenzo Snow and First Council of the 70 member Jacob Gates. They conversed a long time. He finally entered into a deep subject on the law of adoption. Brother Gates said he didn't believe in it, as did also Brother Snow. On another occasion, Brother Gates saw him and asked him plainly. President Taylor said he knew nothing about it, and also just lately when asked by Brother Snow, President Woodruff knew nothing about it. It hadn't been revealed to him. I know this at this time to say or show a prevailing feeling among the 12 that they don't understand it. George Cannon also said he didn't understand it." Wilford Woodruff's sentiments in 1887 are similar. "I have adopted this rule in sealings and adoptions, to take such as the Lord has given me and leave the results in his hands. Paul talked a good deal about adoption, but we did not understand much about it until the Lord revealed it to Joseph Smith, and we may not perhaps understand it now as fully as we should. Still, the sealings and adoptions are true principles, or our prophets have been badly deceived." President Woodruff changed the policy in 1894 to seal within biological families as far back as were known, and then to seal and adopt the last parents to Joseph Smith. This made adoption less of an issue and the genealogical search for ancestors of greater concern. But by 1922, the de-emphasis on adoption allowed it to be ignored altogether. The practice that President Woodruff announced in 1894 was deleted in the published account by the Utah Genealogical Society and from Clark's Messages of the First Presidency. Okay, so much has been said about affidavits or sworn legal statements claiming that Joseph had plural wives. A series of affidavits was collected in 1869 to defend the church's practice of plural marriage. Let's take a look at one in particular created by Eliza R. Snow. In testimony provided for a court case in the 1890s, Eliza's brother Lorenzo Snow, who at this time would have been the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, initially conflates sealing with marriage, as Brigham did in his 1847 Winter Quarters address, and then corrects himself. Describing the way the prophet Joseph had explained his relationship to Lorenzo's sister, Eliza, he said the following, quote, "I returned from that European mission in the spring of 1843, about the middle of April. I said in my direct examination that about 10 days after I returned from that mission, I had a private interview with Joseph Smith. In that private interview was the time when he told me he had taken my sister as a wife. He did not say she was taken as a wife and married to him. He said she was sealed to him for eternity. I was not acquainted with the practice of sealing at this time. I had never heard of it before. I never saw the ceremony of sealing performed in the days of Joseph Smith. I never knew anything about the practice of sealing during the days of Joseph Smith. He didn't tell me anything about it at the time I had this conversation with him. He told me at that time that other parties had been sealed to him for time and eternity, but he didn't name any of them but my sister Eliza R. Snow. That was the first time I ever heard of sealing. Members of the church have manufactured sentiment and stories in support of plural marriage. This excerpt from a 1973 Ensign article says, talking about Eliza, her beloved husband, the prophet Joseph Smith, had been cruelly murdered after only 2 short years of marriage. End quote. Yet Eliza herself, in an 1877 letter, claimed that she was never Joseph's wife in the carnal sense. She wrote, "You ask," referring to President Smith, "did he authorize or practice spiritual wifery? Were you a spiritual wife? I certainly shall not acknowledge myself of having been a carnal one," which aligns with what her brother Lorenzo Snow said about what Joseph Smith said about his relationship with Eliza Snow. Several informative articles provide persuasive evidence that the often repeated story of Emma pushing Eliza down the stairs in a fit of jealous rage did not happen. Eliza's claim that she was never Joseph's wife in a carnal sense provides confirmation for these claims. If Eliza never slept with Joseph, she never could have been pregnant with his child in the first place, and yet these stories have been retold many times to reinforce the idea that Joseph was a polygamist. This is the affidavit cited to justify the claim that Eliza R. Snow was one of Joseph's plural wives. Given what we understand about Joseph and Eliza's relationship, the language used is ambiguous enough that without a prior understanding of their actual relationship, one could easily misconstrue the claim that she was married or sealed, which is what the language says, she was married or sealed to Joseph to support him having taken her as a plural wife. What's fascinating about many of the other affidavits collected in this time frame is that they use the exact same ambiguous wording. For example, this affidavit for Zina D. Huntington Young states she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith. This affidavit for Presenda Lathrop Huntington Kimball says she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith. This affidavit for Ruth V. Sayers claims that she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith. Interestingly enough, the day the marriage or sealing occurred was left out. This affidavit for Emily Dow Partridge Young claims she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith. This affidavit for Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde claims she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith. This affidavit for Rhoda Richards claims she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith. And this affidavit for Melissa Lott Wiles claims the same thing, that she was married or sealed to Joseph Smith. So some claim that the women who signed these affidavits would never have subjected themselves to the shame and ridicule that would have been directed toward any woman at that time who admitted to involvement in plural marriage if it weren't true. But these affidavits were collected in Utah 17 years after the church's public announcement of the practice of polygamy in front of friendly witnesses that were also members of the church. One witness, a probate judge named Elias Smith, had multiple wives. Brigham Young's daughter provides some important contextual information that helps us understand that there was status and financial benefit accorded to some of those that were considered plural wives of the prophet Joseph. For example, starting from the quote here on the slide, Emily Partridge and the other bereaved young plural widows were approached by President Young and the 12 after the martyrdom with an offer of their shelter and sustenance for time only, of these brave girls who had dared ridicule and even mobs and death to enter into that order. They were free to select any of these associates, BR crossed out, or of the prophet as their earthly protector. Eliza R. Snow, after reaching the valley, was glad to accept shelter and protection under his, word left out, but she, page break, like several other widows, was never his wife in actual fact. These women didn't face scorn or social rejection for breaking moral norms of the day. Quite the opposite. These quote-unquote brave girls were respected for their supposed marital connection to the prophet Joseph, which connection secured them financial support. In Utah, in 1869, social rejection and financial loss were the risks that they likely faced if they didn't sustain the story that they had actually been Joseph's wives. For example, in 1882, Phoebe Woodruff, the first of Wilford Woodruff's 7 wives, speaking at a mass meeting of Mormon women held in defense of polygamy, said, "If I am proud of anything in this world, it is that I accepted the principle of plural marriage and remained among the people called Mormons and am numbered with them today." However, a few days later, a longtime friend asked, "How is it, Sister Woodruff, that you have changed your views so suddenly about polygamy? I thought you hated and loathed the institution." Phoebe responded, "I have not changed. I loathe the unclean thing with all the strength of my nature. But, sister, I have suffered all that a woman can endure. I am old and helpless, and would rather stand up anywhere and say anything commanded of me than to be turned out of my home in my old age, which I should be most assuredly if I refused to obey counsel." The first wife of Wilford Woodruff loathed plural marriage, but publicly supported it because she feared her husband would turn her out of her home if she didn't obey his commands. This interesting quote from Eliza R. Snow, commenting on adoption ceremonies in the temple, provides a glimpse into the social status and pride associated with having been considered a plural wife of the prophet Joseph. Quote, "When persons are adopted to Joseph Smith, they are initiated into his family and become his heirs. A wife or someone to represent a wife as proxy must be present, but who is to be the mother is not designated. I officiated in the adoption of 75 individuals at one time when I was in St. George. Others have been adopted since who do me the honor to choose me for mother. Some of them felt much disappointed because I was not present, but I think it will make no difference. We shall have our choice. I shall feel quite honored if after you are adopted into our family, you and Brother East recognize me as mother." From the beginning of the Church's public announcement of plural marriage as a practice in 1852, they emphasized church members' right to practice polygamy as a constitutional right to worship as they pleased. As the practice came under increasing attack by the federal government, it became acceptable for members of the church to lie about their involvement in plural marriage to protect and preserve the practice. This is demonstrated in the 1890 Manifesto, in which the church announced to the federal government that, and this language comes directly from the manifesto itself, also known as Official Declaration 1 in the back of your Doctrine and Covenants, quote, "We are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any person to enter into its practice." Those words were read by President Wilford Woodruff in General Conference. First Presidency member Lorenzo Snow then moved that church members, quote, "accept his declaration concerning plural marriages as authoritative and binding," end quote, which they did by vote. That church leaders at the time lied about their intent is made clear by the quote in the bottom right corner of the page that came from the church's website in April 2020 that says, "In all, 8 of 19 members of the Quorum of the 12 who served between 1890, when the original manifesto was given, and 1904 married new plural wives during those years. In the 14 years after the manifesto, after having declared that, quote, 'we are not teaching polygamy or plural marriage, nor permitting any persons to enter into its practice,' end quote, 8 members of the Quorum of the 12 took new plural wives. The manifesto was a lie intended to trick the federal government into leaving the church alone. If the church at the highest levels was willing to lie to protect the practice of plural marriage, would we expect members to act any differently?" In a letter written to President John Taylor in 1887, Charles W. Penrose, who'd been the editor-in-chief of the church's newspaper, the Deseret News, since 1880, and who had become an apostle in 1904, expressed concern that, quote, "the endless subterfuges and prevarications which our present condition impose threatens to make our rising generation a race of deceivers." In this light, the intentionally ambiguous married or sealed verbiage of the affidavits, coupled with the general sentiment that it was acceptable to lie to protect polygamy, as well as the possibility that their financial support may have been dependent upon their cooperation, make their value, the affidavits, as evidence that Joseph Smith had physical relationships with any of these women suspect. As context for the next few slides, I should introduce William Clayton. He wrote entries in Joseph's journal for the last couple of years of Joseph's life and held various administrative positions in the church and community. Here we read that he served as recorder and scribe to Joseph Smith from 1842 to 1844 at Nauvoo. After Joseph and Hiram died, the question of who should lead the church loomed large. On August 8, 1844, the saints gathered to listen to both Sidney Rigdon and Brigham Young to decide who would lead the church. Sidney spoke first, after which Brigham adjourned the meeting for 2.5 hours before he would speak. During the break, Heber C. Kimball of the 12 paid Emma $1,000 in cash to show the goodwill of the Quorum of the 12. This appears to have been an attempt to buy Emma's support for Brigham, who was set to make his claim to lead the church when the meeting re-adjourned. A week later, William Clayton had a conversation with Emma in which she heatedly stated that, quote, it was secret things which had cost Joseph and Hiram their lives. 5 days after expressing her desire to expose the secret things that had cost Joseph and Hiram their lives, she received a legal demand, signed by William Clayton, for her to pay $1,000 to the city of Nauvoo on a debt of her deceased husband. To Emma, this may have appeared as Brigham's way of recovering the exact amount of money the apostles had given her less than 2 weeks previously, just before the church voted to accept the 12 to lead the church. Emma was likely viewed as uncooperative and even dangerous to those who stood to lose if certain secrets were exposed. William Clayton recorded in his own journal his interaction with Emma on August 15th of 1844. He wrote, Thursday 15th, I went to see Sister Emma as she had sent for me this a.m. I found her very cross. She grew warm and said that all the business of the trustee must be presented. We had no secrets that we must keep back from the public, for she was determined to have everything settled now. I replied to her that there were many things which I was unwilling the world should know anything about, and should not lend my hand to ruin the church. She said I neglected her and spent my time in the secret council of the 12, and it was secret things which had cost Joseph and Hiram their lives. What secrets did William Clayton not want the world to know about that could ruin the church? Remember Sidney Rigdon's public accusation in this same time frame that it was a fact so well known that the 12 and their adherents have endeavored to carry on this spiritual wife business in secret and have gone to the most shameful and desperate lengths to keep it from the public. And Hiram's warning several months before that false doctrine was being taught that, quote, a man having a certain priesthood may have as many wives as he pleases, end quote. William Clayton unwittingly provides insight into what those secrets may have been in a journal entry he made in his own diary in May of 1843 when he wrote, conversed with H.C.K., that's Heber C. Kimball, concerning a plot that is being laid to entrap the brethren of the secret priesthood by Bro H. and others. Bro H. is Hiram Smith. The secret priesthood was teaching that a man could have as many wives as he pleases, directly in opposition to Joseph and Hiram. In an 1874 affidavit, William Clayton would claim that Joseph told him, it is your privilege to have all the wives you want. William Clayton's missionary journal provides some insight into the potential genesis of his involvement in these secrets. After being baptized in 1837 by Heber C. Kimball, Clayton quit his job as a factory clerk to serve a mission about 35 miles away from his wife in Manchester, England. From 1838 to 1840, he served as a counselor in the British Mission Presidency with Willard Richards, who's pictured at the bottom right. Clayton's journals describe his involvement with other women in the mission field. In these journal entries, William Clayton uses S to indicate Sarah Crooks, R indicates Rebecca, Sarah's sister, M indicates Manchester. Also, the blank lines indicate sections that were initially recorded as a missionary, but later crossed out. The images at the bottom of this slide are actual pictures of some of the crossed out portions from his missionary journals. On April 6, 1840, he wrote, quote, got home at 11 o'clock, S, which I assume means supper, with Sarah and Rachel. They gave me a pint of porter, which is beer. Sarah washed my feet. The following text is scribbled out. On April 9, 1840, quote, she gave me a glass of porter. I got to M about 11 o'clock, nearly through. Sarah had some egg milk ready, and she washed my feet and then went to bed. The following text has been crossed out. On April 22nd, 1840, Sarah Crooks went with me, preached at Worsley. You'll notice that Sarah accompanies him in public a lot, so this wasn't something that he appeared to be hiding at the time. Sarah Crooks went with me, preached at Worsley. We got home about 1 o'clock, took S with H. Walker. Sis Poole washed my feet. S. Crooks gave me an orange, with the following text scribbled out. On April 28, 1840, she went with me to Eccles, preached to a very full house on 1 Corinthians 3. Sarah washed my feet when we got home, and I took Sarah with Rebecca. The following text was crossed out. This foot washing seems inappropriate and strange, and yet it happens often enough that it seems part of an established custom or practice. This is interesting because during Joseph Smith's life, a spiritual movement called Cochranism emerged in the eastern United States, which advocated peculiar religious practices, including secret late-night meetings for the select few, solemn oaths of secrecy, foot washing, and spiritual wifery. Early converts to the church included former Cochranites from Maine. A pattern emerges that whatever happens after Sarah washes William Clayton's feet has been scribbled out. It's important to note that at this point, Clayton had never been to the U.S. or met Joseph. He was taught and baptized by 2 members of the Quorum of the 12 and was serving at the time he made these journal entries in the British Mission Presidency with another apostle, Willard Richards, once again pictured bottom right, prior to coming to the U.S. and meeting Joseph for the first time. So this matters because these 2 men would subsequently be directly involved in the creation and revision of Joseph's journals and church history. Clayton's mission journal continues. On April 29, 1840, I went to Row Green, waited till after 8 o'clock before any came, preached on 1 Corinthians 3, slender house, got home about 11:30. S. washed my feet and gave me supper. The following text is scribbled out. On May 6, 1840, Mrs. Bradford gave me a glass of porter. Sarah washed my feet. The next section is all crossed out. On May 19, 1840, took a little refreshment. S. with Sarah, 1 pint porter. She washed my feet. We sat together till 2 o'clock. These entries establish a pattern of returning home together, drinking a beer, then doing something that later gets crossed out. In his journals, William Clayton displays a certain naive openness of his feelings, especially in the accounting of his love for Sarah. He mentions her 84 times by name, 17 times by her full name. In contrast, he never mentions his wife Ruth by name. In his 26 references to Ruth, he simply states, "my wife." These mentions are brief and emotionless and typically comprised of "received or wrote letter to my wife." On the other hand, Clayton filled pages of his journals with his excursions and feelings for Sarah Crooks. This provides an interesting window into what the secrets may have been that William Clayton didn't want exposed that could destroy the church. Clayton's disclosures point toward the same secretly practiced spiritual wifery that Joseph and Hiram were trying to root out of the church, being potentially linked to Brigham's claim that he received revelations approving plural marriage while on a mission with the 12 in England before Joseph ever taught it. In trying to determine what really happened, we're forced to ask ourselves who seems more trustworthy, Emma Smith or William Clayton. Clayton would later claim to be the scribe that wrote down section 132 as it was dictated by Joseph. Although the foreword to section 132 explains it was received in 1843, it wasn't released publicly for the first time until 1852, 8 years after Joseph's death and 5 years after the saints had already arrived in Utah. If all of D&C 132 really did come from the Lord through the prophet Joseph, it would have been, from what I can find, the only document Joseph ever created in support of plural marriage. Did this revelation come directly from Joseph Smith, or is it possible that something Joseph received from the Lord was added to or revised before it was released publicly to the church? There is an important reference to the revelation that we now know as D&C 132, which occurred in the summer of 1843 when Hiram Smith read a revelation on marriage that Joseph had received to the Nauvoo High Council. In the Nauvoo Expositor, Austin Cowles, a counselor to Nauvoo Stake President William Marks, who'd heard the revelation read by Hiram, made certain claims about its contents. Minutes from a Nauvoo City Council meeting on June 10, 1844, just weeks before Joseph and Hiram died, captured Joseph and Hiram's reaction to Cowles' claim that the revelation talked about, among other things, the doctrine of a plurality of wives. Quote, Counselor Hiram Smith spoke to show the falsehood of Austin Cowles in relation to the revelation referred to, that it referred to former days and not to the present time as stated by Cowles. The mayor said he had never preached the revelation in private as he had in public, had not taught it to the highest anointed in the church in private, which many confirmed. The mayor said he had never preached the revelation in private as he had in public, had not taught it to the highest anointed in the church in private, which many confirmed. The mayor said, on inquiring of God regarding the passage in the Bible, that the resurrection they neither marry, etc., I received for an answer, men in this life must be married in view of eternity, and that was the full amount of the content of the revelation." End quote. That's why it's reasonable to wonder if what was published over 8 years later as D&C 132 had been changed or added to beyond what Joseph originally received. Let me read it again. The mayor said he had never preached the revelation in private as he had in public, had not taught it to the highest anointed in the church in private, which many confirmed. The mayor said, on inquiring of God regarding the passage in the Bible that in the resurrection they neither marry, etc., I received for an answer, men in this life must be married in view of eternity, and that was the full amount of the content of the revelation. Joseph specifically invalidates the argument that Brigham would rely heavily upon to legitimize plural marriage, which is that Joseph taught plural marriage to a trusted few in private. At this point, it's not just Emma versus Brigham. It's Emma and Joseph and Hiram and William versus Brigham. For emphasis, I repeat a quote referenced earlier. Joseph was crystal clear. I am bold to declare I have taught all the strong doctrines publicly and always teach stronger doctrines in public than in private. Remember Joseph's altered journal entry we discussed at the beginning of this presentation, the one that states, and gave instruction to try those who were preaching, teaching, or appears to be the word practicing crossed out, the doctrine of plurality of wives. On this law, Joseph forbids it, and the practice thereof, no man shall have but one wife. The reason it's so important is because it was recorded on October 5th, 1843, nearly 3 months after Joseph purportedly received the revelation we now know as D&C 132. Understanding that Joseph's position against plural marriage didn't change after receiving a revelation on marriage indicates that the portions of D&C 132 that support plural marriage were likely added by Brigham after Joseph's death. The evidence in this presentation came from Joseph after he supposedly received Section 132, including his journal entry in October of 1843 that Brigham changed after Joseph's death, the Times and Seasons condemnation of polygamy by both Joseph and Hiram in February of 1844, Hiram's condemnation of plural marriage in March of 1844, and Joseph's public talk in Nauvoo in May of 1844, denying involvement in plural marriage or spiritual wifery. All of these occurred between the time D&C 132 was supposedly received and the day that Joseph and Hiram died. After Joseph's death, the church used different terms to describe polygamy. It appears attempts were made to distance the practice from Joseph's condemnation of spiritual wifery or polygamy by attempting to rebrand the practice as plural marriage or celestial marriage. This new terminology couldn't change the fact that Joseph had always condemned sexual relations outside of marriage between one man and one woman. Helen Mar Whitney, daughter of Apostle Heber C. Kimball, explained that, quote, at the time in Nauvoo, spiritual wife was the title by which every woman who entered into this order was called, for it was taught and practiced as a spiritual order. This quote comes from a church publication entitled Plural Marriage as Taught by the Prophet Joseph from the Juvenile Instructor Office in 1882. This presentation should make it clear why there was conflict between Emma and Brigham. Emma claimed, I was threatened by Brigham Young because I opposed and denounced his measures and would not go west with them. At the time, they did not know where they were going themselves, but he told me that he would yet bring me prostrate to his feet. It seems easy to think this may have been an exaggeration on the part of Emma. Would Brigham really talk like that, telling the prophet's widow that he would one day bring her prostrate to his feet? It shouldn't seem like an exaggeration when we understand that was how Brigham spoke about those with whom he was at odds. In a talk delivered at winter quarters in November of 1847, Brigham complained about two of the apostles who opposed him acting as president over the church. Brigham said, quote, like Joseph, I will not be trammeled. I would rather have to be shot in Carthage jail than to be under the necessity of having to run to my brethren before I can speak before the public. If my lot is to preside over the church, and I am the head of the church, I am the mouthpiece and you are the belly. The two apostles who opposed him acting as president of the church at the time were Parley Pratt and John Taylor. Concerning them, he threatened in the same talk, I shall never have any rest until I get into that valley and Parley Pratt and John Taylor bow down and confess they are not Brigham Young. They are devoid of the authority. That's from the Complete Discourses of Brigham Young, Volume 1, page 255. Historical records were changed. Stories were invented. Lies were told. If we limit ourselves to the evidence least susceptible to manipulation, to what was publicly available while Joseph was alive, we would have to conclude that Joseph consistently fought against polygamy. The fairest way to evaluate someone is not by what their critics say, but by their own words. In his own estimation, Brigham was not like Joseph. Joseph interacted with the Lord face to face. Brigham, by his own admission, did not. 24 years after being ordained as an apostle, Brigham admitted, "I have flattered myself if I am as faithful as I know how to be to my God and my brethren, and to all my covenants, and faithful in the discharge of my duty, when I have lived to be as old as was Moses when the Lord appeared to him, that perhaps I may then hold communion with the Lord as did Moses." It was believed Moses spoke to God face to face at age 80. "I am not now in that position, though I know much more than I did 20, 10, or 5 years ago. If I am faithful until I am 80 years of age, perhaps the Lord will appear to me and personally dictate me in the management of the church and people. I am not to obtain this privilege at once or in a moment. True, Joseph Smith in his youth had revelations from God. He saw and understood for himself. He had heavenly visions. Angels administered to him. The vision of his mind was open to see and understand heavenly things." 3 years later, Brigham admitted that his circumstances in this regard hadn't changed. "I think it likely that after a while I may be able to so humble myself and become like a little child as to be taught more fully by the heavens. Perhaps, when I am 80 years of age, I may be able to talk with some being of a higher sphere than this. Moses saw the glory of God at that age and held converse with better beings than he had formerly conversed with. I hope and trust that by the time I am that age, I shall also be counted worthy to enjoy the same privilege." End quote. Brigham died at the age of 77. In the transition from Joseph to Brigham, something important was lost. And that may have happened because of what was gained in the transition from Joseph to Brigham, which appears to have been plural marriage. The contrast is clear. 11 days before Joseph died, he taught, "I am bold to declare I have taught all the strong doctrines publicly and always teach stronger doctrines in public than in private." If I accept Brigham's opposite version of history, that only a few of Joseph Smith's intimate friends knew it previous to its being published to the world, which was several years after his death, then I have to accept that Joseph was a liar, hypocrite, polygamist, and pedophile. I do not believe Joseph was any of those things. There is something else that changed in the leadership transition from Joseph to Brigham. Joseph's fundamental approach to leading the saints was to encourage each person to engage directly with God, to seek answers and discern truth individually and independently. In Brigham's paradigm, he was the one authorized to ask and get answers from God and tell church members what they needed to do. In an 1842 talk to the Relief Society, Joseph read the 14th chapter of Ezekiel, said the Lord had declared by the prophet that the people should each one stand for himself and depend on no man or men in that state of corruption of the Jewish church, that righteous persons could only deliver their own souls. Applied it to the present state of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, said if the people departed from the Lord, they must fall. And this is the most important part, that they were depending on the prophet, meaning himself, hence were darkened in their minds, in consequence of neglecting the duties devolving upon themselves. End quote. Each of us has to stand for ourselves. The early saints were depending too much on Joseph, and the consequence was that their minds became darkened. The 14th chapter of Ezekiel addresses the same issue. Ezekiel talks about how some of the elders of Israel came up to him to ask him questions rather than taking their questions directly to the Lord. The Lord curses these elders for engaging in idolatry by going to the prophet instead of going directly to God. Ezekiel 14 reads, "Then came certain of the elders of Israel unto me, and sat before me. And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, these men have set up their idols in their heart, and put the stumbling block of their iniquity before their face. Should I be inquired of at all by them? Therefore speak unto them, and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Every man of the house of Israel that setteth up his idols in his heart, and putteth the stumbling block of his iniquity before his face, and cometh to the prophet, I, the Lord, will answer him that cometh according to the multitude of his idols, that I may take the house of Israel in their own heart, because they are all estranged from me through their idols." Prophets can become idols. "Therefore, say unto the house of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God, Repent and turn yourselves from your idols, and turn away your faces from all your abominations. For every one of the house of Israel, or of the stranger that sojourneth in Israel, which separateth himself from me, and setteth up his idols in his heart, and putteth the stumbling block of his iniquity before his face, and cometh to a prophet to inquire of him concerning me, I, the Lord, will answer him by myself. And I will set my face against that man, and will make him a sign and proverb, and will cut him off from the midst of my people, and ye shall know that I am the Lord. In contrast to Joseph's teaching that each one should stand for himself, and that members were depending on the prophet, hence were darkened in their minds, in the talk in which the church's practice of plural marriage was announced to the world, Orson Pratt, an apostle, said this about Brigham and his role, quote, "So in these days let me announce to this congregation that there is but one man in all the world at the same time who can hold the keys of this matter, but one man has power to turn the key to inquire of the Lord, and to say whether I, or these my brethren, or any of the rest of this congregation, or the saints upon the face of the whole earth, may have this blessing of Abraham conferred upon them. He holds the keys of these matters now, the same as Nathan in his day." Thanks to Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible, which he referred to as the fullness of the Scriptures, we better understand Jesus' teachings in this regard. Jesus clearly taught that responsibility for our beliefs and actions cannot be outsourced to any other person or institution when he taught in verse 44, "Therefore let every man stand or fall by himself, and not for another, or not trusting another." Jesus also specifically warns his followers about being led astray by church leaders in verse 46. "And if thine eye which seeth for thee, him that is appointed to watch over thee to show thee light, become a transgressor and offend thee, pluck him out." In 1831, Joseph taught the saints that except the church receive the fullness of the Scriptures, they would yet fail. I think the often shallow content published by the church about Emma is driven by ignorance rather than malevolence. If Emma were alive today, I'm pretty sure the 7 things she'd want the women of the church to know wouldn't start with understanding that women have an extraordinary work to do, or that we need to be unified, especially in serving others. I'm pretty sure that the first thing she'd want the women of the church to know is that Joseph said, "I would pity the people that should follow Brigham Young as a leader, because he would lead them to hell." It's interesting to note that nearly every major doctrinal innovation that Brigham introduced to the church has since been dropped or disavowed, including plural marriage, blood atonement, blacks in the priesthood, and the Adam-God doctrine. In this presentation, I focused on statements Joseph made during the last couple of years of his life to highlight the contrast between Joseph's public teachings and D&C 132, which was supposed to have been received 11 months before he died. The reality is that secret abominations and wickedness perpetuated by those that lied about having Joseph's support had been going on for quite a while. This quote, published in the Times and Seasons in 1840, is an example of that. Quote, "Thus we find that there has been frauds, secret abominations, and evil works of darkness going on, leading the minds of the weak and unwary into confusion and distraction, and all of which has been endeavored to be palmed upon the presidency, who were ignorant of these things which were practiced upon the church in our name." I think church leaders are good people trying to do the right things and help people draw closer to the Savior, but that doesn't mean that what Brigham did was approved by God. I think these things are very important because I firmly believe Joseph Smith was a prophet of God. God gave me a powerful testimony of the Book of Mormon, and many are losing their faith in the prophet Joseph and the Book of Mormon because of what I believe are falsehoods perpetuated about Joseph by the church. After hundreds of hours of research, I feel like the Lord has helped me see that some of the things I thought were true weren't. I realized that I personally needed to take responsibility for all that I believe rather than outsourcing that function to the church. The traditions of our fathers can be difficult to overcome, but truth, first and foremost, must be my primary objective if I am to become like God. D&C 93 teaches us that the glory of God is intelligence, or in other words, light and truth, and that light and truth forsake that evil one. The Heavenly Father I have come to know and love does not seem like the author of a system where a man with enough priesthood keys can have as many wives as he wants. The power in the church comes from the love and support, the brother and sisterhood that binds us as disciples of Jesus Christ. It is real and it's important. A community that helps us understand the gospel and grow in light and truth is important. The most important keys in a family are the powers needed to guide each household in the ways of light and truth. As Christ taught, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there am I in the midst of them." The growth of the church has been fueled by the strength of the truthfulness of the Book of Mormon and the fellowshipping of the members. I suggest you Google and read Joseph Smith's Monogamy, a free download that discusses some of the evidence that indicates that Joseph Smith was a monogamist. I'll put a link in the description. I also encourage you to read the teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith and the words of Joseph Smith. Thank you for taking time to consider this information. I think the Lord knew what he was talking about when he called Emma Smith an elect lady. I believe Emma was telling the truth and that Joseph was honest, chaste, trustworthy, and monogamous.
Thanks for listening. If you like this show, share it with your people. Join the conversation on Facebook, YouTube, or hemlockknots.com, where you'll find show notes and source material for these subjects and much more.